I feel like whenever I make general statements about the Souls games, I always have to clarify whether or not Sekiro is included in whatever it is I'm talking about. I feel like it used to be that way with Bloodborne too, until the term Soulsborne was coined. I would ask myself why Sekiro is considered different from the other Souls games, but in many facets, it's obvious why that's the case. There's no character creation, the story is more laid out in front of you because you follow a specific character, and the combat system is quite different from the sword and shield based combat that From Software spent the prior 10 years perfecting. In many ways, Sekiro is the outlier, but what's crazy about saying that is that Sekiro did so many things differently. However, I feel that Sekiro is the closest that From Software has come to what could be considered a perfect game. They scaled the game back in a few ways and propelled it forward in others, but just the right amount in each case. So let me try and explain to you what I mean. From the very start of the game, returning From Software fans will definitely have noticed the lack of character creation like I mentioned in the intro. Every game prior follows the player-made character on their journey to finish the game how they want to, especially when it comes to how the player wants to build their character in terms of weapon choice and the use of spells and summons. While Sekiro does have some build variety with the prosthetic tools and shinobi arts, it is clear that the game is much more restricted in player choice, at least build-wise. This could be a turnoff for some people who enjoy the immense customization you can get into when playing a Souls game, but in a way, this plays into Miyazaki's vision more than ever. Often in Souls games, they get criticized for being too difficult by people who don't want to invest the time it takes to get good at them. While I don't want to touch too much on difficulty right now, my rebuttal to them would be that the games are difficult because that is the vision that Miyazaki is going with. When creating these games, the difficulty is just as important as the story in some cases, and it is what gives these games the character and notoriety that they have garnered so far. So what does this have to do with character creation? Well, with choosing to follow a single character and minimizing the directions the player can go with the build variety, From Software can make an even more catered experience, if that makes sense. Every boss fight, every area, every element of the game is built around knowing almost exactly how the player will be playing at that point, resulting in a more balanced and enjoyable experience. If anything, the prosthetic tools are just there to potentially make things a tad bit easier for those who are having a bit of trouble, but rarely do these tools break the game in any way, since for almost every fight you don't actually need the prosthetic tools. Of course, if you watch streamers, then you will know that there are actually many ways to break the game with these tools, but for a normal player, they're just a helping hand. But it's like I said, From Software knowing what tools the player may have at a certain point will allow them to balance the game around these tools. The Blazing Bull is an annoying boss fight that feels so overtuned that, as a running joke, modders will literally undertune the boss in their Sekiro overhauls that are supposed to actually make the game harder overall. So if you don't know what I mean, these extremely hard mods people will make to make the game even harder, they will still nerf the bull as kind of like a running joke in the community. However, prior to the bull in the normal game, you can buy the firecrackers at 2 different merchants, which don't remove all of the difficulty from the fight, but definitely make the fight much easier, as you can just wait for the firecracker proc, then go in and wail on him, rinse and repeat. If the firecrackers didn't exist at this part of the game, I can almost guarantee that the amount of people to make it past this boss would have reduced by a sizable amount, since even though it's technically a mini boss, you can't skip the bull without using a glitch. This isn't the only game to give you the tools you may need to conquer a strong foe, but it just fits in with my argument that From Software has an even better time catering things to the player when they have more control over the course of the game itself, and they have an idea of where the player will be at that point in the game. On the topic of difficulty, if you were present on the internet when Sekiro came out, you will be well aware of the intense debate that this game created. The first modern From Software game without an online option, you have to play through this game 100% on your own with no outside help besides online guides. The journalists were fuming on the release of this game. However, From Software had some systems that they put in place to try and prepare for this difficulty change in a way. The biggest and most obvious change was the addition of resurrection, essentially giving you a second chance in a fight, and in some cases a third or even a fourth chance. From Software understood that this would probably be their hardest game to date, so they did some things to soften the difficulty besides the resurrection change for the more casual players, since they know no-hit players would still be able to no-hit it no matter what. In addition to resurrection, they added in a pause screen that actually pauses the game, unlike every other Souls game where the game continues even if you open up your inventory and such, which is definitely an underrated feature in terms of easing the difficulty. The ability to use any item in your inventory without having to shuffle through your inventory mid-fight while the enemies are still in pursuit of you has definitely saved me many times, which you will most likely see in my footage. There is no hiding it though. This game is probably still the hardest From Software game, even after Elden Ring, as Elden Ring has online summons on top of things like Spirit Ashes and more trivial items to use to make the game easier. But even with this fact, I think the difficulty is about how hard it should be, as once you get the deflecting down, this game potentially turns into one of the easiest. I can appreciate a game that almost forces you to learn one of its main combat systems, as if you make it to the end of the game, you will most likely be extremely skilled in terms of deflecting. This combat system is one of, if not the biggest highlight for me when it comes to Sekiro. It's almost crazy to think about that they nearly perfected their role-based sword and shield combat in the previous titles, then just up and changed the entire combat system entirely. It is in a small amount of circumstances that you actually bring the enemy down to 0 health, where the posture meter is much more important to pay attention to. Deflecting starts out as something that takes some time to get the hang of. A learning curve is present, but that is present in almost every Souls game. However, after you overcome this and get the deflects down, this game turns into one of the smoothest and most satisfying games that From Software has ever released. The fights feel more like actual fights, like the intimacy of a fight is there. Once you deflect an entire combo successfully, you are met with a feeling of satisfaction, and the game encourages you to try and deflect as much as possible, pushing the whole hesitation is defeat motif. Genichiro is probably the first real boss you will encounter that pushes this system extremely harshly, as without deflecting, Genichiro will be a nightmare. You learn and progress until you realize you're going through his phases with little to no damage taken from him, culminating into an extremely enjoyable third phase, where he starts throwing lightning at you, which leads to an even more satisfying defense system of lightning deflecting, where you jump up and smash the lightning down for a huge chunk of health and posture damage. And if you've played this game, you know exactly how satisfying that is. It's gotten to the point where if I accidentally dodge a lightning attack, then I get upset because I much rather would have just deflected the lightning. The way you learn to deflect in this game, the way you can physically feel yourself getting more and more coordinated, and how the timings line up ever so perfectly, this is the highlight of the game that I mentioned earlier. Most people would have called From Software crazy for almost abandoning the main system in their previous games that they cultivated over the last 10 years. And I can definitely say that I don't speak for myself when I say that I enjoyed the rolling shield and sword based combat that they created in the previous Dark Souls games. So originally when Sekiro was first about to release, when I found out that they changed the combat system almost entirely, I was definitely skeptical. I don't think anyone would have believed that they would absolutely nail it on their first try, with Sekiro now being mine and many others' favorite, at least in terms of the combat system. I just can't stress enough how insanely well it turned out, and I'm really hoping for a sequel to Sekiro, or at least a sequel that takes this combat system and expands upon it more. I talked about a lack of character customization earlier, so in a similar vein, I want to talk about Sekiro himself and what having a single main character does for the rest of the game, specifically in terms of the relationships that are garnered. In other Souls games, you're basically just a dude that just so happens to stumble into the situations you find yourself in for one reason or another, and your journey is set out before you as many people have tried and failed to complete said journey. However, in Sekiro, the storyline is much more focused and streamlined because the main character is Sekiro, if that makes sense. That's not to take away from the storylines in other Souls games, as I'm just trying to drive home the the presentation of the story is slightly different, so you get different things out of it in terms of emotions and meaning. For example, let's talk about Great Shinobi Owl, also known as Sekiro's adoptive father. Towards the middle to the endish of the game, you are presented with the choice to obey your father's wishes and stick to the iron code of the shinobi, or to defy your father and save Kudo. At this point, the player doesn't know much about Owl. However, for Sekiro himself, this is quite the dilemma he has to overcome. Owl was the guy who told Sekiro to take care of Kudo in the first place, so he has created relationships with Kudo, Emma, and even Ishin. Now Owl is asking Sekiro to renounce all of that, and whichever choice you choose will literally alter the course of the game entirely. As if you follow your father, you become Shura, essentially meaning someone who has killed so many and so much that you go on killing more and more without really knowing why. The evil ending with a line of bloodshed. Or you can go the other way and save Kudo, which is probably what many people will go with on their first playthrough, which forsakes your father's wishes, resulting in you killing Owl after a hard-fought battle. These two diverging paths are where the emotions spring from that I was talking about earlier, and they are even more impactful because of the relationships you have created. Something that is propelled by the idea of following a main character that the story revolves around. I hope that makes sense. This was like my fourth iteration of trying to explain what I mean, but it's one of the bigger things that separates Sekiro from the other Souls games, so I thought it was important enough to put it in here. Sekiro probably has the single highest boss quality average among all of the Souls games, in my opinion, of course. I don't think there's a single required boss that I would call bad, and quality over quantity is extremely present here. Some of the other Souls games will try and pad the game with extra bosses to try and make it feel more full, but Sekiro only has a whopping 17 actual bosses, and they are all at least mid to high level bosses, and the game still feels full, if you get what I mean. There's quite a lot of variation within their designs, especially when you get towards the more humanoid creatures, and each of them, while still being challenging, felt fair for the most part. The pacing was really well done as well, as Gyobu felt like he belonged at the part of the game that you encountered him in. He was extremely imposing upon first glance, but you soon realize that his moves are heavily telegraphed, and he is more of a tool to help you learn how to deflect attacks properly, and even use your prosthetic tools within boss fights. Genichiro, like I mentioned earlier, is probably the wall that anyone who has made it this far without deflects will inevitably stop at. However, the satisfaction of beating him is immensely pleasing, but there is one more thing about Genichiro that plays a huge part in this game. When you first encounter him at the very start of the game, most people will lose in a near instant, as this is how the game developers expect things to go. However, when you encounter him at the top of Ashina Tower, you are more well equipped and will most likely have an easier time, especially since you get more than one try to practice on him. But then, at the end of the game, if you don't choose the Shura ending, you will encounter him one last time, and this time, he will most likely be even easier, mostly because you are extremely skilled by this point, but also because he is in a state of decay, with you thwarting his plans multiple different times throughout the game. You have pushed him further and further to his limit, to the point where on his last defeat, he resorts to summoning his ancestor to try and clean up his mess. He's a benchmarker in a way, for the player to see their own growth. It is a nice touch to see a game developer keep an antagonist relevant from beginning to end, rather than just defeating them once and moving on, as it can show the world growing around you. Some of the other bosses that I enjoyed thoroughly were Great Shinobi Owl, which I talked about earlier. He's a nice change up from the normal samurai enemies, as he would employ similar tricks that you have, like shurikens and firecrackers. You can feel the difference in movement that he possesses that separates him from other enemies like Genichiro, since like you, he is a shinobi, and I appreciate that attention to detail. From Software did excellent in distinguishing the combat styles to make boss fights feel different from each other, even when many of them are all just sword fights. I liked Guardian Ape a lot too, an extremely cool design in a wide open area, and a combat style that makes you almost unlearn every skill you have developed up until this point. This boss feels much more reminiscent of previous Dark Souls bosses. I also really like True Corrupted Monk. True Monk has a really cool design, and it's fought in a cool arena with variation in terms of its phases, and the fight feels weighty, When you successfully block a combo and get knocked back a large distance from the sheer power behind the monk's attacks, it feels good. Then being met with the realization that the monk was under the control of an immortal centipede, it's intense from beginning to end, and is the bridge to one of the best looking areas in any From Software game ever, but I'll get to the areas later. While almost every boss in this game is amazing and to some degree, I don't want to flood the video with boss talk, as the video is already getting pretty damn long by this point, so thanks for sticking around if you have. But the last boss I do want to mention is Ishin, the Sword Saint. The first phase of this fight is actually Genichiro, like I mentioned earlier, in his broken state. However, once you dispatch Genichiro fairly easily, might I add, Ishin gets summoned, and you can feel the flow of the fight shift. He comparatively feels solid and deadly. His moves feel strong, and he has like a presence behind him that should be feared. And it makes sense. I mean, he's literally the founder of the Ashina clan, so... But once you get to a second phase, the fight really kicks up in intensity. Especially on the first playthrough, this fight will make your heart race and requires tons and tons of learning to get to a point where you can take him down effectively. But once you get there, you truly feel like you have mastered everything this game has to offer. An extremely hard boss to cap off an extremely hard game. While Bloodborne is my favorite game of all time, which I won't go into why in this video, I believe that Sekiro is arguably the best game From Software has released. Obviously this is my opinion, and you can't really decide which game is the best because it's all subjective, but it's not the most groundbreaking or shocking in any way, but the systems it puts in place, coupled with the theme of Sengoku Japan, the characters that make the world feel alive, and the art style, all culminate into an experience that was probably better than most were expecting, including myself. Sekiro was most likely supposed to be a test subject in a similar vein to how Elden Ring was also a test subject in different regards, but it just so happens that From Software nailed Sekiro so well that it feels like they have been making games in this specific style for years. It is the outlier out of From Software's discography, but it feels the most polished and the most natural to play. I really do hope they expand on Sekiro in some way, like a sequel, or at the very least take more inspiration from the systems that Sekiro introduces, because they really did something special here with this game. Thanks for watching.